Deep beneath the Montana pines, a line of granite runs through the forest like the remains of something deliberately constructed. It extends for 275 feet. Its stones fit together with remarkable precision. One reportedly weighs 91 tons. When it was discovered in 1996, it looked less like a geological accident than a wall someone had built and abandoned. But geology offered another answer, a natural fracture. And that tension is the thread connecting everything that follows. 22 mysteries where the evidence is real, the investigations are documented, and the explanations don't always close the case. Ancient settlements that disappeared, objects found where they seemingly shouldn't be, structures whose origins remain disputed. None of these stories needs a conspiracy to be disturbing. Sometimes the unsettling part is simpler. We have the evidence, we've studied it, and we still don't know exactly what we're looking at. The Montana Wall is first. The forest above Whitehall, Montana keeps its secrets close. Lodgepole pine and sage grew thick over this stretch of the tobacco root foothills, and for most of the 20th century, nothing about the hillside suggested it held anything but rock and root. Then, in 1996, Linda Welch and Christopher Borton were clearing brush on land they had just purchased when the vegetation gave way to something else entirely. A wall, not a fence line, not a rock slide. A wall, in the architectural sense. 275 feet long, rising as high as 24 feet in places, built, or formed, from massive granite blocks fitted together with a precision that seems to defy the ordinary chaos of geology. Some of these blocks are estimated to weigh as much as 91 tons. In places, the seams between them are so tight that visitors have described being unable to slide a knife blade into the gap. Ground-penetrating surveys suggest the structure continues another 15 feet below the surface. A second parallel wall once ran higher up the mountainside, though it has since collapsed into rubble. The mainstream explanation is straightforward, and geologists who have examined the site tend to favor it. This is a natural granite outcropping, the product of joint sets and fracture patterns common to intrusive rock formations of this kind. Rhyolite and granite, as they cool and settle over millions of years, can develop remarkably regular angular fractures, sometimes columnar, sometimes blocky, that mimic the look of deliberate stonework without a single human hand involved. By this reading, the sage wall is simply what the tobacco root batholith looks like when erosion strips away the soil that once hid it. And yet the questions don't fully close there. Why do the blocks appear to interlock rather than simply stack? What explains the small knob-like protrusions on some stones, features that at other ancient sites around the world, from Peru to Egypt, have been associated with the deliberate transport of megalithic stone? Why does the wall appear to run along a line that some observers connect to solstice alignments? None of this constitutes proof of construction, but it is enough to keep the conversation from settling. It is here that the fringe theories begin, unhurried and undeterred by the geologist's consensus. Some who have visited the site point to the resemblance between the sage wall's fitted stonework and the polygonal masonry of Inca sites like Sacsayhuaman, a resemblance that has led to comparisons, however speculative, with lost or forgotten building traditions. Others go further, suggesting the wall may be evidence of a pre-Younger Dryas culture in North America, a civilization erased from the historical record by the climate catastrophe that struck roughly 12,000 years ago, a period, as it happens, that the conventional history of the continent has very little to say about at all. There are claims of underground chambers, of a megalithic metropolis extending beneath the mountain, of energetic or ceremonial significance drawn from more esoteric traditions entirely. None of these claims have been substantiated by controlled excavation. None have been dismissed by one either, because the kind of systematic archaeological investigation that could settle the matter has so far not been done. What remains is a wall on private land in Montana, visited now by geologists, tourists, and seekers of very different persuasions, each finding in its stones what they came looking for. The rock does not argue back. It simply sits there, weathered and immense, indifferent to the question of who, or what, put it there. Perhaps it is nothing more than a striking accident of granite and time. But if it is not, It would mean that something significant happened on this hillside long before anyone was writing it down. The wall isn't telling. Not yet. Nearly 2,000 miles east of that Montana hillside, past the plains and the Mississippi and the long climb into New England's hardwood forests, the ground hides its stonework differently. There are no towering blocks here, no 91-ton monoliths. Instead, tucked into 100 acres of quiet woodland in Groton, Connecticut, the mystery shrinks down into a scatter of low stone chambers, tumbled walls, and a curious circle of standing stones known, for reasons no one has fully traced, as Gungywamp. The name itself is strange enough to invite speculation before a single stone is examined. Some believe it derives from a native word meaning church of the people, or swampy place between two hills, though linguists who have looked into it are far less certain, and the etymology remains, like much of the site, unresolved. What is certain is that Gungywamp has been drawing curious visitors for well over a century, and puzzling them for just as long. The site's centerpiece is a cluster of stone chambers, small roofed structures built from dry stacked fieldstone, several feet high, some large enough for a person to crouch inside. At first glance, they resemble root cellars, and this is, in fact, the explanation favored by most historians and archaeologists who have studied them. Colonial New England farmers built structures very much like these throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, using them to store vegetables, dairy, and other perishables through the harsh winters. Connecticut alone has hundreds of similar chambers scattered across old farmland, many still tied to documented property records and known families. And yet Gungywamp resists a tidy resolution. One of its chambers has drawn particular attention, a structure whose doorway appears to align with the sunrise on the spring and autumn equinoxes, casting a shaft of light directly into the chamber's interior on those two mornings each year. Observers who have documented the phenomenon describe the light entering with striking precision, illuminating the back wall in a way that seems almost too deliberate to be accidental. Colonial farmers, of course, were not ignorant of the sun's movements. An equinox-aligned doorway is not, on its own, beyond the reach of 18th century know-how. But it raises a question that lingers over the whole site. Why would a simple root cellar be built with this kind of astronomical care? Then there is the matter of age. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological surveys conducted at Gungywamp beginning in the 1970s, most notably by researcher and archaeologist David Barron, produced findings that some interpreted as evidence of activity considerably older than the colonial period. Charcoal deposits and soil layers that raise the possibility of use stretching back centuries, even millennia, before European settlement. Critics have pushed back hard on these interpretations, noting the difficulty of dating a stone structure by the material found near it, and the ease with which older organic material can end up in disturbed colonial-era soil. The debate has never been fully settled, and it tends to resurface every time the site draws new attention. It is this uncertainty that opened the door to Gungywamp's more speculative chapters. In the 1970s, a research organization called the Gungywamp Society began actively investigating the site, and it was around this time that comparisons to European stonework first began to circulate. Some visitors and researchers noting a resemblance between the chamber's construction and stone beehive huts found in early medieval Ireland, structures associated with Celtic Christian monks who were known to build in dry stacked stone for shelter and worship. Could Irish monks, or some other pre-Columbian European visitors, have reached the Connecticut coast centuries before Columbus and left these structures behind? The theory has never gained traction among mainstream archaeologists, who point out that no other corroborating evidence, no artifacts, no inscriptions, no additional sites forming a broader pattern, has ever been found to support transatlantic contact of this kind. But the resemblance, superficial or not, has proven difficult to fully dismiss in the popular imagination. Stranger still are the reports that have nothing to do with stonework at all. Visitors and investigators to Gungywamp have long described compass anomalies at the site, needles spinning erratically or refusing to settle in certain locations, particularly near what has come to be called the Whispering Chamber, or the site's inner circle of standing stones. Some attribute this to naturally occurring magnetite deposits in the local bedrock, a mundane if imperfectly mapped explanation. Others have proposed more exotic causes, from unusual electromagnetic activity to theories that defy conventional geology altogether. No comprehensive survey has ever definitively mapped the cause of these disturbances across the site, which means the anomaly remains, quite literally, unresolved by instrument as well as by history. Ghost stories have attached themselves to Gungywamp as well, as they tend to do wherever silence and old stone meet. Reports of disembodied voices, unexplained cold spots, a persistent local sense that the woods here do not feel entirely empty. These accounts belong more to folklore than to archaeology, and they are impossible to verify by any method available to either discipline. But their persistence, generation after generation, says something of its own about how this place is experienced by the people who walk through it. What Gungywamp offers, in the end, is not a single unsolved question, but a small constellation of them, layered one on top of another like the stones themselves. A root cellar, or something older. A coincidence of sunlight, or a deliberate design. A colonial farmer's tool shed, or a monument built by hands no history book remembers. The chambers do not resolve the matter by simply standing there, damp and dark and quiet under the Connecticut canopy. They hold their silence the way old stone always does, patiently, and without any apparent need to be believed. The question that lingered at Gungywamp, is this a farmer's ordinary handiwork, or something the farmer himself would not have understood, travels well. It resurfaces 60 miles to the northeast, in the hill town of Goshen, Massachusetts, population under 1,000, where the ground opens into a single narrow shaft that has been asking the same question, in a different accent, for well over a century. The shaft sits near the base of a hill, not far from the town cemetery, in a stretch of dense clay hardpan, soil so tightly packed that digging into it requires a pick, not a shovel. That detail matters more than it first appears. No one digs a well into clay hardpan when better draining soil lies nearby. It is, by every practical measure, the wrong place to put one. And yet a well is exactly what the shaft resembles at first glance. 3.5 feet wide, lined with dry stacked stone, descending a straight 15 to 16 feet into the earth. It is what happens at the bottom that turns a plausible well into the Goshen mystery. Instead of ending in a basin, the shaft opens into 2 separate stone-lined tunnels, corbelled with tightly fitted capstones, branching off in opposite directions. One tunnel runs west, narrower, sloping gently. A passage that some investigators believe may have functioned as a drain, keeping the main shaft from flooding. It has been traced roughly 70 feet before it is capped by flagstone. The other runs east, toward the cemetery, wide enough for a crawling adult, extending some 15 feet before. By most accounts, it once opened into a small chamber. Since collapsed, its dimensions no longer possible to confirm. No one in Goshen can say who built it, or when. The structure was already there, sodded over and forgotten, when a group of hunters stumbled across it in the late 1800s. There is no mention of it in the town's founding records, no diary entry from an early settler claiming credit, no deed or ledger that accounts for the labor it must have taken to quarry, haul, and fit that much stone by hand. For a town where most historical construction is at least loosely documented, the silence is conspicuous. Did the original settlers simply never notice it? Or was it already old, already hidden, by the time Goshen was a town at all? The mainstream explanation, and the one favored by most who have formally examined the site, is considerably less romantic than the mystery's nickname suggests. In 2014, archaeologist Stephen Murozowski of the University of Massachusetts' Fisk Center led an exploratory excavation above the tunnel and recovered artifacts in the surrounding fill dating to the 18th century, squarely within the era of Goshen's colonial settlement. His working theory, echoed by local historians for generations, points not to lost civilizations, but to lost prophets. A hideout built by counterfeiters or bootleggers, using the tunnel's second passage as a concealed escape route toward the cemetery, where a fleeing man might vanish among the headstones unseen. It is a theory that fits the physical evidence reasonably well, and it has earned the site its more mundane alternate name, Goshen's Counterfeiter's Cave. But the artifacts found above the tunnel date its use, not necessarily its construction, and that distinction has kept the door open for wider speculation. Researchers who have studied comparable stone chambers across New England, structures at Upton, at America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire, and dozens of similar sites scattered from Vermont to the Massachusetts coast, have proposed a very different chronology, in which some of these tunnels and chambers predate colonial settlement by centuries or more. At one such site in Vermont, researchers documented an engraved geometric grid they interpreted as an astronomical calendar, along with soil anomalies strikingly similar to those found at Goshen. Advocates of this theory, most notably the late researcher James Whittle, who conducted the last formal exploration of the Goshen tunnels in 1980, have pointed to construction on a hidden, still unopened chamber, said to lie deeper within the structure. A claim that has never been definitively confirmed and never fully dismissed. It was that unopened chamber and the rumor of something more than colonial contraband buried beneath Goshen that drew television investigators back into the tunnel decades later, searching by flashlight for a room no living person has verifiably entered. What they found only added a layer to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. A well that was never a well. A tunnel that answers to two very different centuries. A chamber that may or may not still exist, sealed somewhere beneath a Massachusetts hillside, waiting on a resolution that a single afternoon of digging could theoretically provide. But that, for over 100 years, no one has managed, or perhaps chosen, to finish. Wind moves differently along a ridgeline than it does in a forest hollow. On the summit of Fort Mountain, in the Cohutta Range of North Georgia, it comes in steady and unbroken, sweeping across a saddle of exposed rock where, for as long as anyone can document, a wall of loose stones has zigzagged between two cliffs, one falling away to the east, the other to the west, nearly 900 feet apart. The wall itself is a modest thing to look at, and that modesty is part of what makes it strange. It rarely rises above 2 or 3 feet today, though sections once stood as high as 7, and it runs anywhere from 4 to 16 feet thick depending on where you measure. It is built entirely of dry-stacked native stone, no mortar, no cut blocks. Just fieldstone gathered from the mountaintop itself and piled into a structure that traces an oddly deliberate snaking path across the terrain. Along its length are scattered nearly 30 shallow pits, along with cairns, stone rings, and what appears to be the remains of a gateway. Early explorers assumed these pits were foxholes or sniper positions. Later surveys found no mention of them in the earliest written descriptions of the site, raising the possibility that they are not original features at all, but the leftover scars of 19th century treasure hunters who dismantled parts of the wall looking for something no one has ever named. What the wall is not, on close inspection, is a fort, despite the name etched onto every map and trail marker in the park. When researchers from the Peabody Museum surveyed the site in the early 1960s, they noted that the structure fails at nearly every basic requirement of a defensive fortification. There is no water source within its perimeter to sustain defenders through a siege. Rather than following the mountain's natural defensive contours, the wall in places changes direction in ways that would expose anyone sheltering behind it to attack from outside. 2 limited excavations conducted during that same survey turned up no artifacts at all. Nothing to date the structure, nothing to identify who built it, nothing to explain why. The most widely accepted archaeological view places the wall's construction sometime in the Middle Woodland period, roughly between 500 BC and 500 AD, attributing it to indigenous peoples who may have used it for ceremonial purposes, as a territorial boundary marker, or as a site connected to seasonal gathering. Though even this dating rests more on regional pattern than on direct physical evidence recovered from the site itself. Georgia's state park system, for its part, has offered a similarly open-ended explanation on its own historical marker: fortification against hostile tribes, or a location for ancient ceremonies. Officially, the question remains unresolved. A marker placed at the trailhead by the state itself concedes as much, noting that the true answer may lie buried in antiquity. perhaps permanently. Into that open space, generations of theories have settled. Some 19th century observers believe the wall was the work of Hernando de Soto's expedition, built around 1540 as a defensive position against the creek. Others have pointed to Cherokee oral tradition, which speaks of the Moon-Eyed People, a pale-skinned, light-haired population said to have lived in the region before the Cherokee arrived, with eyes so sensitive to daylight that they could see only at night, retreating instead into underground shelter. In some versions of the legend, it was the Moon-Eyed People who built the wall. In others, it was built by the Cherokee to defend against them. A separate and more far-reaching legend attributes the structure to Prince Madoc, a supposed 12th century Welsh nobleman said to have sailed to America some 3 centuries before Columbus and left behind fortifications in his homeland's architectural style. A claim tied, its supporters note, to a nearly identical stone structure near DeSoto Falls, Alabama, and to minor fortifications reported near Chattanooga. None of these theories rests on corroborated archaeological evidence. All of them persist regardless. Locally, the mystery has taken on a quieter, more atmospheric life as well. Hikers on the summit trail describe an unease that seems to settle in around the wall's gaps and breaks. A sense, difficult to pin down, of being observed from the tree line. Others report cold spots near the old gateway, sounds that don't quite resolve into footsteps or wildlife, motion at the edge of a flashlight beam that vanishes when addressed directly. Park rangers attribute it to wind and animals. They also, by more than one account, avoid staying on the summit after dark. What remains, after more than a century and a half of survey, excavation, and speculation, is a wall that fits no single explanation particularly well. Too impractical to be a fort, too old and too silent to yield its ceremonial purpose, too tangled in oral tradition to be cleanly separated from legend. It sits exposed to the wind on a ridge in North Georgia, visible to anyone willing to make the climb, its stones still arranged exactly as its builders left them. Only the builders never said why. A wall can at least be measured in feet, its stones counted and weighed. Not every mystery leaves that much to hold on to. 2,000 miles west of that Georgia ridgeline, in a dry canyon outside Hemet, California, the evidence shrinks down to a single carved surface. A boulder, a little under 4 feet square, marked with lines no one now living can fully explain. The stone sits in Reinhardt Canyon, reached today by a paved but weed-cracked road that dead ends at a gate, then a short uphill walk past quail and scrub brush to a patch of ground enclosed by 2 chain-link fences. It was here, in 1914, that a rancher named Myers, out hauling wood, stumbled across a carving unlike anything he, or soon enough, anyone else, had seen in the region. Word spread through the local women's clubs who pressed archaeologists to come examine it. The experts arrived, studied the stone, and left without an answer. More than a century later, that answer still hasn't come. What Myers found was a petroglyph roughly 46 inches square, incised into the rock in a pattern of interlocking rectilinear shapes. A maze, formed from a design that unmistakably resembles a swastika, an ancient symbol used across dozens of unrelated cultures worldwide for thousands of years before it was seized and permanently redefined by 20th century fascism. A second, smaller swastika sits in the lower corner of the carving, though this one is known to be a later addition. Added by an unknown hand sometime after the 1930s, a reminder that even the site's vandalism carries its own layer of historical confusion. Artifacts recovered near the stone suggest the original carving is at least 500 years old. Some researchers believe it may be considerably older. The trouble is not the age. The trouble is the design itself. Petroglyphs across California and the broader American Southwest tend toward a recognizable visual vocabulary: animals, human figures, symbols tied to rivers, trails, hunting grounds, celestial events. The Hemet maze stone shares almost nothing with that tradition. Its geometric, labyrinthine structure stands apart from the rock art found anywhere else in the region, which is precisely what has kept archaeologists from confidently filing it under any known cultural signature. A pattern with no clear ancestor and, so far, no clear descendant either. Into that gap, theories have poured freely. The most widely circulated, and most thoroughly disputed, traces the carving to Chinese Buddhist monks, sailors supposedly shipwrecked or blown off course along the California coast as early as 500 AD, who left the maze behind as a symbol drawn from their own religious tradition. It's an evocative idea, and it has real defenders. It also has serious problems. No Chinese settlements, tools, or artifacts of the relevant period have ever been found anywhere in California, and researchers who have compared the two directly note that the swastika found in genuine Chinese Buddhist art bears little real resemblance to the specific geometry carved into the Hemet stone. A second, more fringe theory reaches even further back, attributing the maze to a supposed Cascadian culture, a hypothetical people, sometimes linked speculatively to Mesoamerican civilizations, whose existence would push the carving's age into the thousands of years, far beyond anything the physical evidence has yet supported. The explanation favored by most archaeologists today is comparatively restrained, that the maze stone is the work of indigenous Californians, part of a localized artistic or ceremonial tradition that, for whatever reason, left behind very little else to compare it to. That theory gained some support from a detail easy to overlook. The Hemet stone is not unique. Similar maze-patterned petroglyphs have turned up elsewhere in Southern California, in Riverside, Orange, Imperial, and San Diego counties, all within roughly 150 miles of one another. One, the Ramona Maze Stone, was found by hikers in 1977. Another, further north, has been damaged over the years by gunfire. Whether these scattered stones represent a single forgotten tradition, a maze culture, as some researchers have loosely termed it, or simply independent, unrelated expressions of a shared geometric idea, is itself still an open question, argued over rather than resolved. No inscriptions accompany the maze. No oral tradition definitively claims it. No excavation at the site has produced the kind of artifact that would settle the matter outright. What remains is a single carved boulder behind two fences in a quiet canyon, holding a pattern that loops back on itself the way its own history seems to, approached from many directions, entered by many theories, and still, after more than 100 years standing in the open air, without a way out. Long before any of this had a name, Burnt Hill, Heath, Massachusetts, the Pocumtuck people who moved through these ridgelines called the place Sunsick Hill. It translates roughly to Stone Place Hill. Whatever stands atop this 1,855-foot knoll in the Berkshires, it seems to have been called that for longer than anyone can say, which is itself the first thread in a knot that has never fully come undone. What stands there today is a scattered arrangement of roughly 40 rectangular stone slabs, some weighing as much as 500 pounds, propped on end and driven into the ground across the hill's summit. Despite the name that has attached itself to the site in recent decades, the Burnt Hill Stone Circle. The arrangement isn't a circle at all. The main cluster forms something closer to an irregular offset rectangle, with additional stones trailing off along the ridge to the north and south, as if the builders, whoever they were, kept working outward from a central idea without ever quite finishing it. The site is remote even by the standards of rural Massachusetts. It sits on private land, off any road a GPS will reliably find, deep enough in second-growth forest that multiple visitors describe getting lost on the way in, sometimes more than once. The name Burnt Hill itself has a far more recent and far less mysterious origin than the stones do. Longtime residents recall the hillside being deliberately burned each season to encourage the growth of wild blueberries, a common New England land management practice with nothing supernatural about it at all. That practical history matters because it points toward the two competing frameworks that have shadowed this site for well over a century. The mundane explanation holds that the stones are colonial in origin, property boundary markers perhaps, or the leftover work of farmers clearing land for pasture, piling rocks as generations of New England landholders did across thousands of similar hillsides. One elderly former resident, recalling childhood visits to the property, remembered an old caretaker in the 20th century wandering the same field, gathering loose stones and adding them to existing walls. not standing them upright with any apparent purpose, simply moving them out of the way. It is a useful reminder that not every stone on a New England hilltop carries ancient intent, and that colonial-era fieldwork can leave behind formations that look far stranger a century later than they ever meant to be. No one who has owned the land in living memory has been able to say who first stood the main stones on end, or why. The answer, by every account, was already lost before anyone thought to ask. The alternative view takes the site's isolation, its scale, and its apparent age as evidence of something considerably older, a pre-colonial ceremonial or observational structure built and used long before European settlers arrived in the Berkshires at all. Advocates of this reading point to the crude, unworked character of the burnt hill stones as a mark of real antiquity rather than a flaw. Unlike the more famous stonework at America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire, roughly 30 miles to the northwest, a site radiocarbon dated to several thousand years old, whose builders remain formally unidentified, the stones at Burnt Hill are simply propped and wedged into place, with none of the fitted precision seen elsewhere. To some researchers, that crudeness suggests an even older, more primal effort at construction. To skeptics, it simply looks like farm work. There is also the matter of what the site meant, or still means, to the region's indigenous communities. Multiple Algonquian-speaking peoples across New England maintained, and in many cases still maintain, spiritual and ceremonial connections to hilltop stone formations, viewing much of the landscape as, in the words of one regional preservation group, a ritualized landscape shaped by generations of use. For decades, some archaeologists and historians dismissed the possibility that native peoples in this region built with stone at all, an assumption that more recent scholarship and oral history have steadily undercut. Whether Burnt Hill specifically was a place of seasonal ceremony, of astronomical observation, of burial, or of some purpose no longer carried in memory or record remains, like nearly everything else about this site, unconfirmed by any formal excavation. The hill has never been properly, systematically investigated by professional archaeologists at all. What is left then is a name that predates written history, a hillside that has been burned, farmed, and quietly rearranged by human hands for at least 2 centuries, and 40-odd stones standing at angles that could be an accident or intention, depending entirely on who is looking. The Pocumtuck called it the Stone Place. No one since has managed to say with certainty what kind of place it actually is. There is a pattern worth naming out loud before we go any further. Nearly every stone structure in this collection arrives carrying 2 lives at once. One as a plausible piece of colonial infrastructure, the other as something considerably stranger. And the site waiting in the hills near South Woodstock, Vermont, carries that duality about as far as it can go. It is known somewhat clinically as Calendar 2. The name comes from what the chamber does, not what it looks like from the outside, which is unassuming. A low, grass-covered mound rising from the forest floor, easy to walk past without a second glance. Step through its low entrance, though, and the structure reveals itself as the largest known chamber of its kind in New England. An interior space roughly 10 feet by 20, its walls built from dry-laid stone and capped by a ceiling of massive lintel slabs, some reportedly weighing several tons and stretching 15 feet across, spanning the width of the chamber without a single support beam beneath them. No mortar holds any of it together. It has stood this way, largely undisturbed, for an unknown but clearly considerable span of time. The chamber earns its name from what happens inside it once a year. On the morning of the winter solstice, December 21st, sunlight entering through the chamber's low doorway travels the length of the interior and strikes the back wall directly. A precise, repeatable alignment that requires no guesswork to observe and no particular imagination to notice. This is not a subtle effect explainable away as coincidence. It is instrument-like in its exactness, and it raises the same question that echoes through nearly every chamber like it's scattered across New England. Why would something built for cold storage need to be built with astronomical precision at all? The conventional explanation, and still the one favored by many historians, holds that structures like Calendar II were root cellars, built by 18th or 19th century colonial farmers to store vegetables through harsh New England winters, then abandoned and swallowed by forest, once westward expansion opened more fertile ground, and the region's marginal hill farms were left to empty out. Hundreds of similar chambers exist across Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and neighboring states, and many of them do line up comfortably with this explanation. Modest, practical, unremarkable structures tied to documented farms and family names. Calendar 2 resists that comfort. Its scale alone sets it apart from an ordinary storage cellar, and researchers who have studied the site closely have pointed to something more particular. The chamber's proportions, roughly 2-to-1 in length to width, mirror a ratio found in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza, a resemblance that mainstream archaeologists tend to treat as coincidental, since the ratio itself is simple enough to arise independently in any number of unrelated building traditions, ancient or otherwise. Still, the comparison has proven difficult to fully set aside once it's been noticed. Adding to the puzzle is a reported opening near the rear of the chamber, a flue-like gap in the capstones, whose function has never been definitively established, though it has been variously read as a smoke vent, a ceremonial skylight, or simply a structural gap accumulated through centuries of settling stone. Interest in Calendar II accelerated in the 20th century, largely through the work of researchers like Byron Dix and James Mavor, whose surveys of chambers across the region, and a woman named Betty Cincerbo, often credited with first drawing wider attention to what she and others came to call megalithic New England, argued for a very different origin than colonial farming. Sites built for ceremonial or astronomical purposes by indigenous peoples, or in the most speculative readings, by pre-Columbian visitors from across the Atlantic, whose presence in New England would rewrite the continent's history entirely. No artifacts have ever been recovered from inside Calendar 2, or the great majority of comparable chambers, which leaves both explanations, practical cellar, ancient observatory, without the kind of physical evidence that could settle the matter cleanly. What is left standing, quite literally, is a mound in the Vermont woods that performs the same trick every winter solstice, has performed it for as long as anyone has been watching, and gives no further indication of who built it to do so, or why they cared enough about that single sunrise to move stones weighing tons into place around it. The light arrives on schedule every December. The explanation has never arrived at all. Betty Cincerbo spent her life convincing skeptics that New England's hillsides held more history than anyone had bothered to look for. 600 miles to the southwest, in the coalfields of Fayette County, West Virginia, a very different cast of investigators, colonels, professors, newspaper reporters, and volunteer archaeologists spent more than a century trying to do the same thing for a mountain most Americans have never heard of, and came away with considerably less to show for it. The mountain is Armstrong Mountain, sometimes called Mount Carbon after the small community below it, rising some 1,500 feet above the Kanawha River on a high, remote ridge between Armstrong and Loup Creeks. There are no roads to the site, no maintained trails. Reaching it requires an hour or more of difficult hiking through dense forest, a fact that has done as much to preserve the mystery as any deliberate secrecy ever could. What waits at the top is not a single wall, but several, as many as 6 windrows of loosely piled stone, curved into rough horseshoe shapes, with the base of each shoe crossing the ridge and the arms trailing down the steep slopes on either side. They vary considerably in scale. One measured only 2 feet high and 20 feet wide. Another stretched more than 2 football fields in length, 25 feet wide, its stones piled some 4 feet tall. None show any sign of mortar or deliberate fitting, described by one 19th century investigator as simply piled up irregularly and loosely. And yet the coordinated shape across multiple separate walls suggests a plan, however primitive its execution. European settlers found these walls already standing when they first pushed into the region, and the questions began almost immediately. Colonel P.W. Norris documented the site for the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology in 1891. Dr. John P. Hale surveyed it again in 1898 for the West Virginia Historical and Antiquarian Society, searching specifically for evidence, burials, pottery, tools, anything that might tie the walls to a known culture or a known purpose. He found nothing. "This examination," he wrote afterward, "unfortunately gives us no clue which might lead to the history of their origin and use. These, as heretofore, are shrouded in mystery dark and profound." More than 60 years later, in 1958, University of Georgia anthropologist James H. Keller, an established expert on the comparable rock walls of North Georgia's mountains, walls not unlike the ones still standing today on Fort Mountain, spent 6 weeks at the site with a formal research grant behind him, determined to finally settle the matter. He too came away empty-handed. The artifacts his team recovered were sparse and unremarkable: hammerstones, a scattering of side-notched projectile points, crude scrapers, mostly fashioned from lower-grade local flint. Nothing datable, nothing conclusive, nothing that pointed toward a single builder or a single era. What the investigators could establish mostly was what the walls were not. They are not positioned for defense. They sit along steep slopes rather than the ridge crests a defensive structure would require, and they stand nowhere near tall enough to repel an attacker unless they once supported a wooden stockade for which no evidence exists. They are unlikely to have functioned as game drives or livestock pens either. Keller noted that the only animal whose size and behavior might have made such an enclosure worthwhile was the bison, and bison are not known to have frequented terrain this rugged. Later researchers, working through elimination rather than discovery, settled on the same conclusion by default: that the walls likely held some ceremonial or ritualistic significance, not because the evidence points there directly, but because every more practical explanation has been methodically ruled out. Nearby, the presence of a Kanawha black flint outcrop, along with evidence of a small-scale flint-working industry and numerous granite hammerstones, despite the notable absence of any granite source in the immediate area, suggests the ridge saw real, sustained human activity of some kind. But activity is not the same as an answer, and the windrow walls of Armstrong Mountain have outlasted every formal attempt to explain them. A significant portion of the surrounding landscape has since been altered by surface coal mining, raising an uncomfortable possibility that whatever additional evidence might once have existed nearby, evidence that could have settled the question definitively, may already have been quietly erased from the record before anyone thought to look for it. What survives for now are the walls themselves, still standing in a stretch of forest so remote that most visitors describe the silence there as its own kind of evidence. No road noise, no structures, nothing modern to mark the passage of time since the stones were first stacked. 3 generations of trained investigators have walked this ridge, mapped its curves, sifted its soil, and left with the same unfinished sentence Hale wrote in 1898. The mountain has kept its own counsel. It has not so far been persuaded to do otherwise. Loosely piled, unmortared stone was the defining feature of Armstrong Mountain. Walls stacked without plan or precision, offering nothing to explain themselves beyond their own persistence. 90 miles northeast, in the small Massachusetts town of Upton, the same basic material, dry, unmortared stone, is handled by a very different set of hands, or so it would seem. Precision, not looseness, is what visitors notice first. The chamber sits at 18 Elm Street, now part of Upton Heritage Park, tucked into a hillside not far from the eastern shore of Mill Pond. From the outside, there is little to announce. A low mound, a scatter of rocks, easy to miss if you didn't know to look. A tunnel roughly 14 feet long and 6 feet high leads inward and downward, narrow enough to require stooping before opening into something considerably more dramatic: a domed, beehive-shaped chamber, some 12 feet across and 11 to 12 feet high, its curved walls built entirely from carefully fitted quarried stone, corbelled inward course by course, until they close at the top beneath a capstone reported to weigh several tons. Visitors describe the workmanship as extraordinary. among the finest examples of dry stone masonry found anywhere in New England, and by some measures, one of the largest and most perfectly constructed of the more than 300 known stone chambers scattered across the region. Who built it, and when, depends entirely on who you ask. The land once belonged to a 19th century leather tanner, and one long-standing theory holds that he constructed the chamber himself, using it as a tannery, stone offering natural insulation for the kind of temperature-controlled process tanning requires. A second, more common theory treats it as an agricultural structure, a colonial-era root cellar built by local farmers to preserve food through the winter, no different in basic function from thousands of similar chambers built across New England's hill country in the 18th and 19th centuries. Both explanations are plausible on their face. Neither has ever been confirmed by a document, a deed, or a dated artifact tying the chamber definitively to its builder. That absence of evidence cuts in more than one direction, and it's here that Upton's more unusual details begin to accumulate. Optical luminescence dating conducted on material associated with the chamber has produced estimates placing its construction significantly earlier than any colonial timeline could account for, somewhere in the range of 1200 to 1500 AD, centuries before European settlement of the area. A separate 1989 study by two archaeoastronomers reached an even more striking conclusion, dating human use of the chamber to somewhere between 700 and 750 AD. And identifying alignments suggesting the space was used to observe the Pleiades star cluster, along with a second alignment marking the summer solstice sunset around 670 AD, determined in part through sightlines to stone piles located across the valley on nearby Pratt Hill. If accurate, these estimates would place meaningful human activity at the site over 1,000 years before any tanner or farmer could have laid a single stone. Virtually no artifacts have ever been recovered from inside the chamber. No pottery, no tools, no Native American material culture of any kind, which leaves every theory, ancient or colonial, standing on inference rather than direct physical proof. That vacancy has, unsurprisingly, invited its own range of speculation. The chamber's resemblance to early stone structures found in Ireland and along the Iberian coast fueled considerable interest in the 1970s in the possibility of pre-Columbian European visitors reaching New England centuries before Columbus. An idea most archaeologists treat skeptically, noting that no other confirmed evidence of pre-Norse European contact with North America has ever surfaced, apart from the well-documented Norse settlement in Newfoundland dating to roughly 1000 AD. Other researchers have proposed a different origin altogether, reading Upton's alignments and its careful construction as evidence of a Native American ceremonial or observational space, a theory that finds some support in a curious piece of colonial-era correspondence. In 1654, Springfield founder John Pynchon wrote a letter describing local reports of a stone wall and strong fort made of all stone, discovered near what is now the Gungywamp region. Proof, at minimum, that stone structures resembling chambers like Upton's were already being noticed and already generating rumor before New England's permanent English settlement had even taken firm hold. What remains, more than anywhere else in this collection, is a structure whose craftsmanship seems to outpace every explanation offered for it. A tannery does not typically require a domed ceiling engineered to hold itself up under a multi-ton capstone. A root cellar does not typically require a sightline to the Pleiades, and yet no root cellar, no tannery, and no 1,000-year-old observatory has left behind the kind of proof that would settle which one Upton actually is. The chamber sits exactly as it was found, dark, precise, and silent, waiting, as it has for centuries, for someone to finally step inside with an answer, rather than another guess. Upton's chamber closes with a capstone weighing several tons, held aloft by nothing but the precision of its own construction. That same engineering signature, massive stone slabs, corbelled walls, weight balanced against weight without a trace of mortar, reappears 30 miles north, on a granite hillside in Salem, New Hampshire, on a far larger and far stranger scale. 30 acres of woodland make up the site once known simply as Mystery Hill, and now marketed to visitors as America's Stonehenge. A name chosen, its own promotional materials openly admit, for its evocative power rather than any established connection to the monument in England. Wandering its trails, a visitor passes an entire constructed landscape. Stone huts and chambers with names like the Sun Deck and the V-Hut, capped by slabs weighing several tons apiece. A network of low serpentine stone walls threading between them. A scatter of standing stones positioned around the hill's perimeter. At the site's center sits its most theatrical feature, the so-called Oracle Chamber. A stone room containing what is described as a hidden bed and a carved speaking tube, engineered so that words murmured from within the chamber emerge audibly at a nearby flat stone slab, known, evocatively, as the sacrificial table. That table bears channels cut into its surface, channels its promoters have long suggested were designed to carry away blood. The theatrical framing is, by design, part of the attraction's business model. But underneath the showmanship sits a genuinely unresolved archaeological question. Radiocarbon analysis of charcoal recovered from the site indicates human activity here dating back roughly 4,000 years, placing it among the older confirmed occupation sites in the northeastern United States. What those early occupants actually built, however, and what came later from very different hands, is where the certainty ends. The documented, verifiable history of the hill's stonework begins far more recently and far less dramatically than any of its later legends suggest. Records place a farming family named Petit on the property beginning in the early 1800s, and for over a century, the leading, most conservative explanation held that the majority of the stone structures were simply the work of Jonathan Patty, an eccentric 19th-century farmer who built his home and outbuildings from the hill's abundant granite. That explanation, once broadly accepted, took a serious blow in 1982. A formal excavation of a stone quarry on the property, conducted under the supervision of the New Hampshire state archaeologist, recovered hundreds of stone chips and flakes consistent with Native American lithic tool-making techniques, evidence that undercut a purely 19th century, purely colonial origin for at least part of the site's construction, even as it stopped well short of confirming any older, more elaborate, megalithic tradition. Into the space between those two conclusions poured decades of far more speculative claims. In 1937, antiquities collector William Goodwin purchased the property and proposed that it had originally been built by Irish Chaldee monks, medieval Christian ascetics who, in his telling, crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. A generation later, Harvard-trained marine biologist Barry Fell examined markings carved into some of the site's stones and declared them Phoenician or Iberian inscriptions, a claim for which he had no formal training in ancient languages, and one that mainstream archaeologists and epigraphers have consistently rejected, in part because markings elsewhere on the property bear a much closer resemblance to ordinary plow scars than to any deciphered ancient script. Boston University archaeologist Curtis Runnels has been characteristically blunt on the matter, noting that not a single confirmed European artifact from the relevant period has ever been recovered anywhere at the site, nor, for that matter, anywhere else in New England. What survives every round of excavation, skepticism, and showmanship is the astronomical layer of the site, which even its harshest critics tend to treat with more caution than the inscriptions or the monk theory. Standing stones positioned around the hill's perimeter align, with apparent intention, toward the rising and setting sun at the solstices and equinoxes, and toward the position of Polaris, the North Star. Whether Native American occupants of the hill, whose presence is well documented by artifacts recovered on site, were responsible for these alignments, as most mainstream researchers now believe, or whether an older, unidentified culture set the stones in place long before, is a question the physical evidence alone cannot answer. Even a professional surveyor who studied the site's layout in recent years concluded that its orientation didn't match the standard compass-bearing methods used by early New England settlers laying out colonial farm lots. A small technical detail, but one that reopens rather than closes the question of who was truly responsible for the hill's geometry. Radiocarbon dates, tool flakes, plow-scarred stone, and a name borrowed from England all sit together on this hillside, pointing in different directions at once. Native Americans clearly used this ground for millennia. A 19th century farmer clearly built here too. Somewhere between those two established facts lies the actual sequence of who quarried, who stacked, and who first aligned these stones toward a solstice sunrise. And after nearly a century of digging, that sequence remains exactly what the hill's older name promised it would. Every mystery so far in this collection has taken the shape of an object left behind. A wall, a chamber, a carved stone, something that endures precisely because it was built to last. Cross the Appalachians, follow the Mississippi south into eastern Arkansas, and the mystery changes form entirely. At Helena Crossing, on a stretch of raised ground called Crowley's Ridge overlooking the confluence of the St. Francis and Mississippi rivers, what endures instead are people, or what was done to them after they died. The site was identified in 1940 by a trio of archaeologists surveying the alluvial valley of the Mississippi River, but it wasn't formally excavated until 1958 and 1960, when archaeologist James A. Ford opened two of its mounds, designated Mound B and Mound C. What he found filled a genuine gap in the archaeological record. The Hopewell culture, a network of Native American societies known for elaborate mound building and long-distance trade networks stretching across much of eastern North America roughly 2,000 years ago, had been well documented in Illinois, and the closely related Marksville culture had been identified in Louisiana. Between them lay nearly 400 miles of the central Mississippi Valley, with no confirmed Hopewellian burial site at all. Helena Crossing sat almost exactly at the center of that gap, and Ford's excavation filled it. The only confirmed Hopewell burial ground ever identified in Arkansas. What he uncovered inside the mounds went well beyond simply confirming a cultural connection. The dead at Helena Crossing were interred with real ceremony. Elaborate log-lined tombs and crypts, some individuals placed in mound fill, others laid directly on the original ground surface before the mound was raised over them. One burial in particular drew lasting attention. A young woman interred with an unusually rich array of grave goods, wealth typically reserved in Hopewell society for people of significant status. It was enough to convince later observers that Helena Crossing wasn't merely a burial ground, but something closer to a resting place for a local elite. Language that has occasionally slipped, not entirely without justification, into talk of ancient royalty. It is what a modern bioarchaeological reanalysis found within some of these burials, decades after Ford's original excavation, that turns Helena Crossing from a notable archaeological find into something considerably more unsettling. Using techniques unavailable to Ford in the late 1950s, researchers re-examining the skeletal remains identified clear evidence of post-mortem processing on several individuals. Cut marks and chop marks consistent with deliberate defleshing and disarticulation, carried out sometime after death but before, or during, final burial. In multiple cases, researchers noted particular attention paid to detaching the jaw, the mandible, sometimes the upper jaw as well, separated from the rest of the skull through what appears to have been deliberate, careful cutting rather than accidental damage from time or excavation. Why the mouth specifically? That question sits at the center of the mystery, and the honest answer is that no one fully knows. Researchers studying Helena Crossing alongside comparable middle woodland sites elsewhere in the eastern woodlands have proposed that the mouth held particular symbolic significance for these communities, a threshold perhaps between the body and the world, or between the living and the dead, worth marking through ritual separation even after death had already done its work. It is a reasonable interpretation, grounded in comparative evidence from other sites of the same era and culture. It is also, by necessity, an interpretation rather than a certainty. The people who performed these acts left no written explanation. They left only the bones, cut in patterns precise enough to rule out accident, and silent as to intent. What this means for our understanding of the individuals honored at Helena Crossing remains an open question layered on top of an already ambiguous discovery. Were these post-mortem alterations a mark of profound respect, an elaborate final rite reserved for people the community considered significant enough to warrant such careful treatment? Or do they suggest something more complicated? Violence, punishment, or a form of ritual conducted under circumstances current researchers can only partially reconstruct? The presence of substantial wealth in at least one burial argues against a simple narrative of degradation. The deliberate, careful nature of the cutting argues against random violence. Beyond that, the evidence resists a single clean story. 2,000 years after these burials were sealed beneath earth on a quiet Arkansas ridge, the mounds have given up their location, their occupants, and even the marks left on their bones. What they have not given up is the reasoning behind those marks, why certain bodies were chosen for this particular attention, and what it meant to the hands that performed it. The dead at Helena Crossing were clearly treated with intention. What that intention was meant to accomplish is a question the bones themselves cannot answer, no matter how closely we continue to look. The question of what lies beneath undisturbed earth followed us out of Arkansas, and never really left. It resurfaces now in the hills outside Clarksburg, West Virginia, at a pair of earthworks that have posed that question for well over a century simply by refusing to be dug up. They are known locally as the Oak Mounds, sitting on private land in Harrison County, not far from the small community of West Milford. The larger of the two rises about 12 feet high and spans roughly 60 feet across at its base. A substantial, deliberate mass of earth, clearly built rather than formed by any natural process, standing beside a smaller companion mound a short distance to the west. Archaeologists who have studied similar earthworks across the region attribute the Oak Mounds tentatively to the Hopewell mound building tradition, with construction likely occurring sometime between roughly 1 and 1000 AD, a window spanning an entire millennium, which tells you as much about how little is actually known here as it does about how old the mounds might be. That vagueness is not an oversight. It is the central fact of the site. In all the time these mounds have stood, and in all the time they have been known to archaeologists, they have never been fully excavated. What lies inside remains, quite literally, undisturbed. A rarity in a state where so many of its most significant mounds were opened, sometimes carelessly, during the 19th century's enthusiasm for treasure hunting disguised as archaeology. That history is worth pausing on, because it explains why so much caution now surrounds sites like the Oak Mounds. 60 miles to the north, in Moundsville, the towering Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical burial mounds ever built in North America, raised by the Adena culture roughly 2,000 years ago in stages over a century of continuous use, was excavated in 1838 by local landowner Abelard Tomlinson in a dig funded largely through borrowed money and driven by most modern accounts, more by hope of treasure than by scientific method. The excavation produced a supposed inscribed tablet, the so-called Grave Creek Stone, whose markings sparked more than a century of debate over ancient alphabets, lost civilizations, and possible transatlantic contact. A controversy that a 2010 forensic-style investigation eventually traced back to likely 19th century fabrication, rather than ancient origin. Whatever authentic artifacts Tomlinson's crew pulled from Grave Creek Mound have since been lost entirely. No one today can say where they ended up. It is a cautionary tale that looms over every unexcavated mound left standing in the state, the Oak Mounds included. Once a mound is opened, whatever knowledge it holds is often only as reliable as the person holding the shovel. There is a further layer to the Harrison County landscape that deepens rather than resolves the mystery. Elsewhere in the region, particularly around the historic mound complex near Moundsville, 19th century settlers described a very different category of structure standing on nearby hilltops and ridgelines. Circular, well-like pits sunk several feet into the earth and lined with dry-laid stone, distinct from the earthen burial mounds and apparently unconnected to any ceremonial bonfire or hearth use. Their function was never determined before most were lost to farming, development, or simple neglect, and no comprehensive survey ever fully cataloged how many once existed or what, if anything, connected them to the mound-building activity nearby. Whether any comparable stone-lined features once existed near the oak mounds themselves is now impossible to say with confidence. The kind of evidence that tends to vanish quietly, plowed under a field or buried beneath a road, long before anyone realizes its significance. What we're left with in Harrison County, then, is less a solved mystery than a preserved one, which is, in its own way, a rarer thing. The oak mounds have not been robbed, not been picked apart by amateur diggers chasing rumors of gold, not been reduced to a plaster cast and a controversy the way Grave Creek's most famous artifact was. They simply stand quietly on private land, holding whatever they hold. Modern archaeological practice increasingly favors leaving sites like this undisturbed altogether, relying instead on non-invasive tools like ground-penetrating radar that can map a mound's interior without ever breaking its surface, a method that, as of now, has not been applied here. So the mounds keep their silence, not because the truth about them is unknowable, but because no one has yet decided the moment is right to ask. Somewhere beneath 12 feet of earth in a Harrison County field lies an answer that has waited patiently for over 1,000 years. It may go on waiting a while longer, and there is something almost deliberate in that patience, as if the ground itself understands that not every question needs to be answered right away. 11,000 years before anyone thought to ask what the mounds of Harrison County were hiding, the glaciers that once covered southern Minnesota were only just beginning their retreat, dragging their weight across a long ridge of exposed quartzite and leaving the rock beneath polished, smooth, and, though no one could have known it yet, ready to be written on. That ridge still runs for roughly 23 miles through the prairie of Cottonwood County, near the town of Comfrey, and it carries a name today that belies the scale of what it holds: Jeffers Petroglyphs. Across a stretch of exposed rock face, researchers have documented somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 individual carvings. Bison, thunderbirds, turtles, human figures, handprints, weapons, and hundreds of other symbols whose meaning has never been definitively established. The oldest of these carvings are believed to date back some 7,000 years. The most recent were made roughly 250 years ago, shortly before the region's indigenous communities were forcibly displaced from the land following the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Taken together, that span makes Jeffers one of the longest continuously used sacred sites documented anywhere in the world. A single rock face that generations of entirely different peoples returned to, carved into, and clearly regarded as significant, across a period of time longer than most written civilizations have existed at all. Much of what appears on the rock is, by now, reasonably well understood, at least in broad terms. Archaeologists in the Dakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribal elders who have worked alongside them for decades have identified the bison as an early and recurring motif, unsurprising given the animal's central role in the diet and culture of the peoples who lived here. The thunderbird and the turtle carry recognized spiritual weight across multiple indigenous traditions in the region. Even the site's practical draw has been explained. Beneath the hard quartzite lies a softer reddish mudstone, pipestone or catlinite, soft enough to carve into ceremonial pipes or grind into pigment, and evidence suggests tribes traveled considerable distances specifically to quarry it, leaving the petroglyphs as an accompanying record of ceremony, prayer, and passage. It is what remains uncatalogued and unexplained on the rock that keeps Jeffers from settling into a fully solved history. Among the thousands of images are figures that resist easy classification entirely. Symbols with no clear referent in the animal world, the human world, or established indigenous iconography from the region. One recurring image, a hand marked with an eye at its center, has been found carved into pottery shards at archaeological sites as distant as Florida, suggesting either extraordinarily long-distance cultural contact or a symbol so fundamental to multiple unrelated traditions that it arose independently more than once. Two very different explanations, and no way yet to say which one is correct. Other carvings appear to represent constellations, suggesting a use for the site that went beyond ceremony into something closer to observation and record-keeping, what one researcher, only half in jest, described as evidence the rock had once served a role, probably used as a university. Elsewhere, human-like figures appear to emerge from a natural cleft in the stone, an image some interpreters read as a reference to an underworld or place of origin, an interpretation offered carefully and explicitly as one possibility among several rather than a settled fact. Even those closest to the site resist the temptation to over-explain it. Descendants of the peoples who created these carvings consulted increasingly and directly in recent decades of research at Jeffers, have cautioned that no single symbol carries one fixed meaning across every tradition that used this rock. A carving that meant one thing to a Dakota visitor might have carried an entirely different weight for an Arapaho or Cheyenne traveler passing through centuries earlier or later. Site staff have described the carvings less as a code waiting to be cracked than as a living vocabulary, added to and reinterpreted by each generation that stopped here to carve, to pray, or to record something worth remembering. And the historical record here is itself incomplete, in the most literal sense. Researchers with the Minnesota Historical Society believe additional uncatalogued petroglyphs likely still exist along the broader ridge, scattered across private land beyond the boundaries of the protected historic site, unrecorded and unstudied. What Jeffers offers in the end is not a mystery of absence, but one of abundance. Thousands of images, a documented 7,000-year span of use, and still no complete accounting of what all of it was meant to say. Or to whom. The rock has outlasted every culture that has carved into it so far. Somewhere among its thousands of unexplained symbols may be an answer that simply hasn't found the right person, at the right angle of afternoon light, to finally read it. A sudden drop in temperature, from the 90s down into the 40s overnight, then climbing back into the 60s by afternoon. That is how one visitor to Putney Mountain remembers the day conditions finally lined up for a proper hike into the hills above this small Vermont town, where a very different kind of stonework than the ridge at Jeffers waits scattered through the trees. Not carved symbols on open rock, but hundreds of stacked cairns and low chambers, tucked into forests so remote that many of the access roads simply stop being roads at all. Putney Mountain sits in southern Vermont, its slopes threaded by unmarked dirt tracks that run through private land and frequently degrade into what the state classifies as Class 4 roads, unmaintained, unplowed, often impassable without four-wheel drive. Reaching the stone features scattered across this terrain typically means driving as far as the road allows, then continuing on foot. What waits at the end of that walk is not one single structure but a whole cluster of them. Modest stone chambers with names as unceremonious as the Pig Pen, a small beehive-shaped structure reported to be in near-perfect condition, and a wider stone circle that some researchers have called the Calendar Circle, its stones seemingly aligned with the sunrise and sunset on the solstices and equinoxes, suggesting a purpose tied to tracking the turning of the seasons rather than simple storage. The debate over who built these structures, and when, runs along the same familiar lines heard across nearly every stone chamber and cairn field in New England: colonial farmer, or something considerably older. But Putney offers a piece of physical evidence that has pushed the conversation further than most. Radiocarbon dating conducted at the site produced results placing construction activity there at roughly 492 AD, a date that lands well over 1,000 years before European settlement of the region, in an era when the Western Roman Empire had only just collapsed. If the dating holds, it would place meaningful, deliberate stonework on this Vermont hillside during a period conventional histories of the region have almost nothing to say about at all. That single-dated result has not settled the matter so much as sharpened it. Even researchers sympathetic to a pre-colonial indigenous origin for these structures caution against leaning too heavily on any one number pulled from any one test. David Lacey, an archaeologist who has spent years examining comparable stone cairn fields across Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest, has been characteristically direct about the state of the evidence. People are quick to conclude these structures are Native American, pre-contact European, or simply colonial farm walls, he's noted, often arguing from ideology rather than data. And the honest position, in his view, is that far more data is still needed before any single explanation can be called settled. Compounding the problem, some of the most extensive cairn fields elsewhere in the state sit on federal land, where regulations currently prohibit the very radiocarbon sampling that might otherwise resolve their age. There is at least a documented paper trail suggesting stone construction of some kind was already being noticed, and already generating rumor, before New England's English settlement had firmly taken hold. In 1654, Springfield founder John Pynchon wrote to fellow colonist John Winthrop, Jr., inquiring after reports of a stone wall and a strong fort in it made all of stone, a letter that predates any documented colonial cairn building in the region by generations, and one that researchers studying Vermont stonework continue to cite as early evidence that something unusual was already standing in these hills when Europeans arrived to ask about it. 17th-century land deeds elsewhere in New England likewise describe Indian fences, language that implies stone construction rather than the wooden fencing colonial farmers typically built. None of this amounts to proof, and researchers examining Putney's cairns and chambers have been careful to say so. A structure's age, its builder, and its purpose are three separate questions, and evidence answering one does not automatically answer the others. A genuinely ancient date doesn't, by itself, tell us whether a chamber served a ceremonial function, an agricultural one, or something else entirely that hasn't yet been proposed. What can be said is that a considerable amount of deliberate, coordinated stone construction happened on this mountain, likely over multiple periods spanning well over 1,000 years, by builders whose identities have not survived alongside their work. The mountain keeps its dirt roads unmarked and its chambers scattered through forest that resists easy access, as if daring anyone determined enough to ask the right questions to first prove they mean it. Somewhere among the pigpen, the beehive chamber, and the solstice-aligned stones of the calendar circle sits a fuller answer than the one radiocarbon dating alone has managed to provide. Waiting, much like the rest of this region's ancient stonework, for a question precise enough to finally draw it out. David Lacey spent years walking Vermont's forests, asking careful, patient questions about stone his colleagues couldn't yet answer. 2,000 miles west, in the volcanic backcountry of California's eastern Sierra, it is Paiute and Shoshone elders and tribal historic preservation officers, working alongside federal archaeologists, who now carry that same patient questioning forward. This time not over stacked stone, but over a single boulder marked with symbols that have outlasted every attempt to fully translate them. The boulder in question sits along one of the many drainages fed by snowmelt pouring down from the eastern face of the Sierra Nevada, part of a sprawling volcanic landscape known as the Tablelands, a plateau of hardened tuff formed roughly 760,000 years ago when a massive eruption blanketed the region in hot ash that later cooled into stone. Across this tableland, and in the river-cut canyons that drain it, ancestors of today's Paiute and Shoshone peoples carved thousands of images into the rock's dark, weathered surface, pecking through the outer patina to expose the lighter mineral beneath, leaving designs that have endured for well over 3,000 years, despite constant exposure to wind, flash flooding, and the punishing swings of desert temperature. The boulder along the east fork of one such drainage carries its own distinct panel, a dense cluster of carvings that includes recognizable figures: bighorn sheep, human hunters, lizard-like forms, interspersed with something else entirely. Abstract geometric patterns, bisected circles, and repeating grid-like markings that correspond to no obvious animal, tool, or celestial body anyone has been able to name with confidence. It is this second category of imagery that keeps researchers returning to sites like this one. The recognizable carvings, game animals, hunting scenes, fit comfortably within what archaeologists understand about the daily and ceremonial life of the region's hunter-gatherer societies, offering a plausible record of subsistence practices stretching back millennia. The abstract symbols resist that kind of straightforward reading. Some researchers have proposed they represent visionary or trance state imagery tied to shamanic ritual practices documented among Great Basin peoples more broadly, geometric forms said to appear during altered states of consciousness, later rendered onto stone as a record of spiritual experience rather than observed reality. Others read certain repeating patterns as a kind of calendrical or astronomical notation, tracking seasonal change in a landscape where survival depended on precisely that kind of accumulated knowledge. Neither theory has been definitively proven, and Paiute elders consulted on rock art throughout the region have consistently cautioned outside researchers against assuming any single, universal meaning, noting that these carvings were never intended as public text to be casually deciphered, and that some of what they encode may not have been meant for outsiders, or even for every member of the community, to fully understand at all. That caution has taken on new urgency in recent years, for reasons that have nothing to do with ancient interpretation and everything to do with modern threat. Sites across this same volcanic tableland region have suffered repeated, deliberate vandalism and theft. Carvings hacked directly out of the rock face using power saws, ladders, and generators. Some successfully removed and sold on the black market. Others damaged beyond repair in the attempt. Federal land managers overseeing the area have called such incidents among the worst acts of cultural vandalism they have documented in the region, comparing the loss to deliberately defacing an irreplaceable religious monument. For tribal communities who continue to regard these boulders as living, sacred spaces, used still today to teach children about ancestral history and spiritual connection, each theft doesn't merely remove a data point for archaeologists. It permanently erases a piece of a language that was never fully written down to begin with, and can now never be recovered in its original context. That fragility adds a particular weight to the unresolved symbols that remain. Every geometric mark still in place on a boulder like this one represents information that exists nowhere else. No accompanying text, no duplicate copy, no way to cross-reference an eroded or damaged panel against a written record, because the record was always the stone itself. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials and stylistic comparison to other regional sites can offer a rough time frame for when carving activity occurred, but they cannot tell us what a given spiral, a given grid, or a given cluster of dots meant to the person who pecked it into rock centuries or millennia ago. That knowledge, if it was ever meant to be legible beyond its original context, has not survived in any form archaeologists can currently access. What remains, then, is a boulder along a Sierra drainage holding both the answerable and the unanswerable side by side. A hunter, a bighorn sheep, rendered plainly enough that their meaning needs no translation, sitting beside a geometric pattern that has kept its meaning to itself for thousands of years. The mountain runoff that carved this canyon continues to run past it every spring, indifferent to the question. The stone, for its part, has never volunteered an answer. Only the shape of a question someone once thought important enough to carve permanently into rock, and important enough, perhaps, to keep just out of reach of anyone who wasn't meant to read it. Water carved this next mystery as much as anyone's hands did. Roughly 500 miles southeast of the Sierra's volcanic tablelands, in the arid heart of West Texas, the desert opens onto an unlikely oasis. 6 artesian springs rising from an aquifer fault beneath the town that would eventually take their name. Fort Stockton, built around the waters known since long before European contact as Comanche Springs. For thousands of years before any fort stood here, this was one of the most reliable sources of fresh water for hundreds of miles in any direction, a fact that made it, inevitably, one of the most heavily used and repeatedly visited places in the entire Trans-Pecos region. Long before the Comanche gave the springs the name history remembers, other peoples had already been coming here for water, for shelter, and, it appears, for something else. To leave a record of their passage carved directly into the surrounding stone. Comanche Springs is recognized today as one of the significant rock art sites of the Big Bend region, its carvings and paintings noted alongside better documented nearby locations like Lewis Canyon and Rock Pile Ranch. And yet, unlike some of Texas's more famous rock art traditions, the images at Comanche Springs resist being cleanly filed under any single cultural signature. That resistance is, in its own way, the whole point of what makes this site strange. Just over 100 miles to the southwest, the rock art found along the Pecos River follows a recognizable, well-studied tradition, the so-called Pecos River style, a body of work produced by a specific archaic period culture with consistent motifs, techniques, and an internal visual logic that researchers have spent decades learning to read. The petroglyphs at Comanche Springs share none of that consistency. Archaeologists who study Texas rock art broadly have noted that sites like this one appear to represent the accumulated work of many different peoples across many different eras, each group adding its own marks to the same stones without any single controlling tradition tying the whole assemblage together. Older, harder-to-date carvings sit alongside more recent additions, likely influenced by, but distinct from, the ancient work around them. An overlapping, layered record built up over what may be thousands of years, left by hands that never coordinated with one another and may never have known the others existed. That layering raises a genuinely difficult question for anyone trying to read the site as a whole. When multiple, unrelated cultures carve into the same rock across an unknown span of centuries, does the resulting assemblage mean anything collectively? Or is it simply a very long list of individual disconnected acts? Water, shelter, and stone drawing return visit after return visit, generation after generation, each leaving its own separate signature with no awareness of contributing to something larger. Some rock art researchers examining broader patterns across Texas and the wider region have proposed that certain recurring geometric and celestial motifs found at multiple, otherwise unrelated sites may reflect shared astronomical observation, alignments to solstices, or symbols echoing recognizable star patterns, passed between neighboring cultures through trade, marriage, or simple imitation rather than direct common ancestry. Whether any of the carvings at Comanche Springs specifically fit that pattern remains an open, largely unresolved question, one complicated by the sheer difficulty of dating rock art that has been repeatedly reworked and added to over time. There is a final, more melancholy layer to this mystery, and it belongs entirely to the 20th century rather than the ancient past. For thousands of years, Comanche Springs flowed reliably enough to sustain a genuine oasis in one of the driest parts of Texas, until large-scale groundwater pumping for irrigated agriculture, beginning in the mid-1900s, drew down the aquifer faster than it could recharge. By the 1960s, the springs that had drawn human settlement to this exact spot for millennia had effectively run dry. The oasis that made this location worth carving a record into again and again, across who knows how many separate cultures and centuries, no longer exists in the form that drew any of them here in the first place. What survives, etched into the stone around the site of those vanished springs, is a record with no single narrator and no complete translation. The layered handiwork of people who shared nothing but a destination, returning across an unknown depth of time to the same reliable water, and leaving behind images that still don't agree on what they were trying to say, or to whom. The water that once explained why anyone came here at all has gone quiet. The stone, older and considerably more patient, is still speaking in a language that has never been fully sorted out. Follow the Mississippi south and west, past the bluffs and the bottomlands, until the great river bends, and a smaller one, the Arkansas, cuts its own path through the delta. Here, beyond a stand of oak and hickory, past fields that flood every spring and dry every summer, the land rises where it has no obvious reason to rise. 18 mounds, some barely visible beneath centuries of grass, others still commanding the horizon. This is Toltec Mounds, though the name itself is the first mystery worth sitting with, for no Toltec ever stood here. The site sits along what was once a curve of the Arkansas River, now a quiet oxbow lake called Mound Pond in Lonoke County, Arkansas. When 19th century settlers encountered the earthworks, they assumed, as so many did across the American landscape, that people so accomplished as the local Quapaw could not have built them. Surely, they reasoned, some older, more exotic civilization was responsible. They reached for a name that meant sophisticated in the popular imagination of the time, and so the mounds became Toltec, borrowed from a Mesoamerican culture more than 1,000 miles away, one that had no documented connection to this place at all. The name stuck. The misunderstanding did not fade so easily. What archaeologists now know is that Toltec Mounds was built and occupied by people of what researchers call the Plum Bayou culture, a distinct Native American society that flourished here roughly between AD 700 and 1050. They were not Toltec. They were not, strictly speaking, part of the later Mississippian mound-building tradition either, though they shared some of its instincts. Earthen monuments, a central plaza, careful attention to the sky. They arrived before Cahokia reached its height along the Mississippi, and they vanished before it fell. At its peak, Toltec Mounds was no small settlement. Excavations have revealed a surrounding embankment nearly a mile in circumference, enclosing a central plaza around which the mounds were arranged. Mound A, the largest, once rose an estimated 49 feet, a striking presence over flat delta land where the horizon otherwise offers little interruption. Radiocarbon dating places the first construction here in the 7th or 8th century, and for nearly 300 years, the site continued to grow. That growth is where the questions begin. Archaeological surveys have identified not one single building campaign, but several layers of construction added over generations, each one altering the shape and function of what came before. Mounds were raised, then capped, then raised again. Structures were built atop earlier structures, sealed beneath new fill, as though each generation felt compelled to bury what their ancestors had made and start again on top of it. Why? One explanation, favored by most researchers, points to renewal ceremonies, a practice documented in later Mississippian cultures, in which mounds were periodically resurfaced to mark the death of a leader, the start of a new ritual cycle, or simply the passage of time itself. Under this view, each new layer of earth was not concealment, but continuity, a way of honoring what came before by literally building the next chapter on top of it. But the pattern at Toltec is not uniform, and that is where the mainstream explanation begins to strain. Some mounds were expanded symmetrically, following careful, deliberate proportions. Others were altered in ways that seemed to break with the earlier design entirely, as though a different group, with different priorities, took over construction, mid-project. Soil analysis has revealed distinct strata, different sources of fill, different construction techniques, layered close enough together to suggest the changes happened within a single generation, not across centuries. What caused that shift? A change in leadership? A change in belief? Something else, not yet named? Then there is the matter of alignment. Researchers studying the site's central mounds in the late 20th century proposed that several of the earthworks were positioned to mark solstice sunrises and sunsets, calculated with a precision that would have required sustained, careful observation of the sky over many years. If accurate, it means the builders of Toltec mounds were not simply raising monuments to power or memory. They were tracking time itself, encoding astronomical knowledge into the very geography of the plaza. It is a claim still debated among archaeologists, some of whom argue the alignments are compelling, others who caution that with enough mounds and enough angles, some alignments will always appear by chance. It's here that the more speculative theories begin to surface, not in peer-reviewed journals, but in the quieter corners of alternative history, where some have asked whether the site's astronomical sophistication points toward contact or influence from cultures far beyond the Arkansas Delta, distant echoes of the very civilization whose name was mistakenly attached to this place a century and a half ago. Mainstream archaeology finds no evidence for this. The tools, the pottery, the burial practices at Toltec mounds all point to a culture that was thoroughly, distinctly its own, indigenous to this river valley, shaped by it, dependent on it. And yet the coincidence of the name endures, a kind of ghost story the site tells about itself, whether or not it's true. By the middle of the 11th century, Toltec mounds was abandoned. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply left. The people who built it, layer upon careful layer, walked away, and no one has ever fully explained why. The Quapaw who lived in the region centuries later held no oral memory of who had raised the earthworks before them. The mounds simply were, ancient even to the people who found them ancient. Somewhere beneath that quiet Arkansas grass, sealed inside layers of earth someone chose to bury rather than remove. The reasons for those choices are still waiting. What did each new generation believe they were finishing? And what, if anything, were they trying to leave unfinished for someone else to complete? Long before any mound rose over the Arkansas Delta, before the Plum Bayou people ever broke ground on their first embankment, other people were already finishing their work 400 miles to the east, in the hill country of northeast Mississippi. Their earthworks would stand silent for centuries before Toltec mounds ever began, a mystery already old by the time the next one started. Today, the Pharr mounds spread across more than 90 acres of open pasture land near Mississippi Highway 6, along the Natchez Trace Parkway. 8 mounds in total, low and grass-covered, scattered across the field with a spacing that seems, at first glance, almost careless, until you notice how far apart they truly are. Unlike the tightly clustered plazas of later Mississippian sites, the mounds at Pharr site hundreds of feet from one another, some barely visible above the tree line, others rising quietly in the middle distance. There is no wall here, no obvious plaza, no defensive earthwork, just space and mounds within it, and the wind moving over the grass. Archaeologists have dated the construction of Pharr mounds to the Middle Woodland period, roughly 1 to 200 AD, making it one of the oldest and largest ceremonial mound complexes in the state, and among the most significant woodland-era sites in the entire American South. That places its builders nearly 1,000 years before the people of Toltec mounds ever lifted a basket of earth. What connects them across that vast stretch of time is not blood or memory, but instinct. The same human impulse to mark the land, to raise something permanent out of soil that would otherwise simply wash away. Excavations conducted in the 1960s, ahead of construction on the Natchez Trace Parkway, uncovered something that set Pharr apart from many of its contemporaries. Cremated human remains, accompanied by an extraordinary range of burial goods. Copper artifacts. Galena. Sheets of mica, cut and shaped with a precision that implies both skill and purpose. None of these materials occur naturally anywhere near northeast Mississippi. The copper has been traced to sources near Lake Superior, nearly 1,000 miles to the north. The mica likely came from the southern Appalachians. Some researchers have proposed the galena, a lead ore prized for its silvery shine, may have origins even farther afield. This is where the mainstream explanation begins, and it is a compelling one. Pharr Mounds was not an isolated settlement, but a participant in what archaeologists call the Hopewell interaction sphere, a vast network of exchange that connected communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic seaboard to the edges of the Great Plains. Under this theory, materials and ideas moved along river systems and overland trails across the entire eastern half of the continent, carried hand to hand, community to community, over months or years, until copper mined near Lake Superior might end up buried with the dead in a Mississippi field. It is an elegant answer, but it raises its own quiet questions. How did a network like this function without any centralized authority, any single power capable of enforcing safe passage across 1,000 miles of forest and river and unfamiliar territory? What made distant communities trust each other enough to exchange their most valuable materials? And why, of all places, here? In this unassuming stretch of hill country, with no major river confluence, no obvious strategic advantage, did such an enormous ceremonial complex take shape? The absence of habitation evidence deepens the puzzle. Unlike many mound sites, Pharr shows little sign of having supported a large permanent population. No substantial village remains have been found nearby. No dense scatter of everyday tools and domestic debris. This appears instead to have been built primarily as a burial and ceremonial ground. A destination, not a home. People may have traveled here, performed their rites, buried their dead alongside materials gathered from across the continent, and left again. If true, it suggests a place understood by many different communities as sacred neutral ground, chosen deliberately for reasons that archaeology may never fully recover. It's in that gap, the absence of a village, the absence of a clear "why here," that the more speculative voices enter. Some who study the site from outside conventional archaeology have wondered whether Pharr's placement carried significance beyond the practical, whether its position along ancient travel corridors and its unusual openness point to a role as some kind of gathering point recognized across a wide and disconnected world, long before recorded history could name it. Mainstream researchers remain cautious about such claims, noting that ceremonial isolation and long-distance trade are well documented elsewhere in the woodland period, without requiring any exceptional explanation. Still, the question of exactly what drew so many distant materials to this particular quiet field has never been fully answered, only reasonably theorized. The mounds remain as they were left, low and green, breathing slowly with the seasons. Somewhere within them, or perhaps within the ground surrounding them that has never been excavated, lie further answers to who gathered here, and why they chose this unremarkable rise of Mississippi hill country as sacred ground worth traveling 1,000 miles to reach. What then connected Lake Superior to a quiet field in Mississippi, 2,000 years before anyone thought to write the story down? That copper, traded hand-to-hand across 1,000 miles of forest and river, did not stop moving once it reached Mississippi. Follow its likely path northwest, along the network of waterways that once carried it, and you arrive eventually at the bluffs above the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in the far western corner of Kentucky. Here, too, copper appears in the ground, but centuries later, among a very different people, and under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The bluff itself commands the view, high ground overlooking the meeting point of two great rivers, a natural vantage that would have made the location valuable for both defense and trade. This is Wickliffe Mounds, a Mississippian period village and mound complex occupied roughly between AD 1100 and 1350. Unlike Pharr, this was no isolated ceremonial ground. Excavations have revealed the layout of an entire community. House patterns, refuse pits, a central plaza, mounds used for both residence and burial. People lived here, generation after generation, in a settlement of real permanence. It was first excavated in the 1930s under Fane King, an amateur archaeologist whose methods, by modern standards, left a great deal to be desired. King displayed excavated burials in situ, uncovered but not fully documented, as a kind of roadside attraction, a practice that would be considered deeply unethical today, and one that has complicated later researchers' efforts to reconstruct exactly what was found and where. It wasn't until Murray State University took over stewardship of the site decades later, applying more careful systematic methods, that a fuller and more responsible picture of Wickliffe began to emerge. And within that picture lies the puzzle that gives this chapter its name: the ceremonial deposits. Beneath and within several of the site's mounds, archaeologists have documented caches of objects that appear deliberately placed rather than simply discarded. Arrangements of pottery vessels, worked stone, and yes, copper ornaments, positioned with a consistency suggesting ritual intent rather than everyday use. Some of these caches include artifacts that show no clear connection to daily life at the settlement. Fine ceremonial pottery, shaped and decorated with more care than any cooking vessel would require. Effigy vessels, some formed in the shape of human heads, their expressions difficult to read across 9 centuries. What were these objects meant to do? The mainstream explanation situates them within a broader Mississippian tradition of ritual deposition, offerings made during construction, renewal, or mourning, not unlike the renewal ceremonies proposed at Toltec Mounds or the burial goods found at Pharr. Under this framework, each cache represents a moment of transition: a leader's death, the founding of a new structure, an act of communal memory made physical and then buried, much as it was in Arkansas centuries later. Seen this way, the deposits at Wickliffe are not so strange. They are one more expression of a pattern that appears again and again across the mound-building cultures of eastern North America: the instinct to mark a threshold by placing something valuable into the earth and closing it away. But certain details resist easy explanation. Some caches contain objects that appear to have been deliberately broken or killed before burial. Pottery smashed, tools snapped, as if the objects themselves needed to be rendered unusable before they could accompany the dead or mark the occasion. Why destroy something before offering it? Researchers studying similar practices elsewhere in the Mississippian world have proposed that breaking an object released it, freeing whatever essence or utility it held so that it might follow the deceased into whatever lay beyond, rather than remaining trapped in a form still tied to the living world. It's a reading grounded in ethnographic parallels among later Native American communities, though whether it truly reflects the beliefs of the people who lived at Wickliffe 9 centuries ago is something no artifact can confirm outright. Other deposits raise stranger questions still. In at least one instance, excavators noted an arrangement of objects that seemed to follow no ritual pattern documented elsewhere in the region, a combination of materials and placement unique enough that some researchers have simply logged it as anomalous, declining to offer an interpretation at all. In the absence of a clear answer, speculation has filled the space, as it tends to do. A few alternative theories have floated the idea that certain deposits might reflect contact or exchange with peoples far beyond the usual Mississippian trade networks, though no verified evidence has ever placed such contact at Wickliffe specifically. Mainstream archaeology remains unconvinced, pointing instead to the vast internal complexity of Mississippian ritual practice itself as explanation enough. Still, the anomaly sits in the record, unresolved, neither confirmed nor dismissed. Wickliffe's mounds are quieter now, folded into the Kentucky bluff country, the rivers still meeting below just as they did 900 years ago. Somewhere in the layers beneath that quiet plaza, deposits remain that no one has fully explained. Objects broken, buried, and left for reasons their makers never wrote down. What was released that day, when someone knelt in the dirt and broke something valuable before laying it to rest? And what, if anything, are we still meant to understand from the pieces they left behind? Every mystery we followed so far has asked the same quiet question in a different accent. Why did people choose to bury, break, or build over what mattered most to them? Perhaps it's fitting, then, that our next stop offers no burial at all, no bones, no pottery, no copper traded down some ancient river. Just stone, stacked in darkness, in the hill country of central Massachusetts, waiting for an explanation that has never fully arrived. Deep in the woods of Petersham, in Worcester County, dozens of stone chambers sit half-swallowed by the forest floor. They are unassuming from a distance, low mounds of earth and rock, easy to miss beneath the leaf litter unless you know to look for the dark seam of an entrance. But step closer, duck through the narrow opening, and the impression changes entirely. Inside, many of these structures reveal careful corbelled construction, stone walls that lean gradually inward as they rise, course by course, until they meet at a capstone overhead, forming a chamber that can stand 5 or 6 feet tall, roomy enough for a person to sit upright in the cool, earth-packed dark. Some chambers run 10 or 12 feet deep. Others open onto small interior niches, as if built for a purpose requiring more than simple shelter. Petersham is not unique in this. Similar stone chambers appear scattered across New England, from Vermont to Connecticut, with some of the highest concentrations found in Massachusetts and neighboring Rhode Island. But the chambers around Petersham, and near the town of Upton not far away, are among the most studied, and among the most argued over. The mainstream explanation is, on its face, straightforward. Beginning in the colonial period, New England farmers built root cellars, partially underground stone structures designed to store potatoes, apples, and other produce at a stable, cool temperature through the long winters. The corbelled technique, using dry-stacked stone without mortar, was a known building method carried over from European traditions, particularly from parts of Britain and Ireland where similar structures had been built for centuries. Farmers had stone in abundance, cleared endlessly from fields being turned to agriculture, and building a root cellar into a hillside was a practical way to put that stone to use while solving a real seasonal problem. Under this explanation, the chambers of Petersham are, at heart, agricultural infrastructure, colonial ingenuity, nothing more mysterious than a very old refrigerator. For many of the chambers, this explanation fits comfortably. Some sit near the foundations of documented 18th and 19th century farmsteads, exactly where a root cellar would be expected. Local histories, in certain cases, even record specific families building specific chambers for specific harvests. But not all of them fit so easily, and this is where the questions begin to gather. Some chambers show construction techniques that seem excessive for the simple task of storing root vegetables. Walls built with a precision and structural ambition that goes well beyond what temperature regulation would require. Why corbel a ceiling to a peaked capstone, a technique demanding real skill and considerable labor, when a simple flat-roofed dugout would preserve potatoes just as well? Why orient certain chambers with an entrance that faces a specific point on the horizon, rather than simply the most convenient slope? Researchers who have surveyed multiple chambers in the region have noted that a number of them align with the sunrise on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year when light entering the passage would travel to the chamber's rear wall or a specific interior stone. If intentional, this would represent a level of astronomical awareness that has nothing to do with storing food and everything to do with marking time. It's a claim that divides researchers sharply. Skeptical archaeologists point out that with enough chambers and enough measured angles, some solstice alignments will emerge by chance alone, particularly when a builder is simply orienting an entrance downhill, away from prevailing wind and toward better sun exposure for drainage. Practical choices that could produce an alignment without any ceremonial intent behind it. Proponents of the astronomical theory counter that the consistency of certain alignments across multiple unrelated chambers is harder to dismiss as coincidence, though harder to dismiss is not the same as proven. Then there is the deeper, more contested question: how old are they really? Precise dating of dry stacked stone construction is notoriously difficult. There's no wood to carbon date in most chambers, no artifacts reliably sealed within undisturbed layers, no clear stratigraphy to anchor a chamber to a particular century. Most professional archaeologists who have examined the New England chambers conclude that the available evidence, where it exists, points to colonial and early American construction, the 18th and 19th centuries, consistent with the root cellar explanation. But the absence of definitive proof for any individual chamber leaves a door open, and outside mainstream archaeology, some have walked through it. A body of alternative theory, popular for decades in certain fringe circles, has proposed that at least some of the chambers may predate European colonization entirely. Structures built by earlier visitors to the continent, Celtic voyagers or other pre-Columbian travelers, whose presence in New England has never been substantiated by mainstream scholarship. These claims typically point to the corbelling technique itself, arguing its resemblance to old-world megalithic structures is too close to be coincidental. Professional archaeologists overwhelmingly reject this interpretation, noting that corbelled construction is not a technique unique to any one culture or era. It appears independently in stone-building traditions around the world, wherever people worked with flat, stackable rock and needed a roof that didn't require timber. Similarity of method, they argue, is not evidence of shared origin. And so, the chambers sit in their uneasy middle ground. Some almost certainly colonial root cellars, ordinary and explainable, others resistant to easy categorization, their true age and true purpose folded into stone that keeps no calendar and tells no names. The town of Petersham has taken some ownership of this ambiguity rather than resolving it, and several chambers on protected land remain open to hikers willing to find them. No plaque offering a final answer, no sign declaring the debate settled. Stand inside one of these chambers on a cold morning, if you're willing to make the walk, and watch how the light behaves as it moves through the entrance. Does it fall where the old farmers needed it to fall, warming a floor once packed with root vegetables? Or does it reach for something else? A wall, a stone, a moment in the yearly turning of the sky that someone, long before written record, thought worth building in stone to remember. Wind through pine needles, the dry scrape of granite underfoot. And then, scattered across a wide, sloped outcrop of bedrock, more than 1,000 small depressions worn smooth into the stone. Some no deeper than a shallow bowl, others plunging nearly 2 feet down, polished to a soft shine by hands that stopped working this rock more than a century and a half ago. Welcome to Chaws. known today as Indian Grinding Rock, in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Amador County, California. The rock itself is a single massive slab of gray-green limestone, called marbleized limestone by geologists for the way ancient pressure and heat transformed it, and it stretches across an area larger than a football field. Across its surface, the Miwok people and their ancestors ground acorns into meal for well over 1,000 years, generation after generation returning to the same depressions, the same stone, wearing each hollow a little deeper with every season's harvest. Today the site holds more mortar holes, 185 of them by the most recent careful count, than any other single rock formation documented in North America. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary record of sustained, continuous human labor. The mainstream explanation for the mortar holes themselves is not in serious dispute. Acorns, particularly from the black oak that still grows abundantly around the site, were a dietary staple for Miwok communities across this region of California, and grinding them into usable meal required exactly this kind of repetitive, concentrated effort. A stone pestle worked again and again into the same spot, hour after hour, until the granite yielded, and a bowl slowly emerged. Ethnographic accounts, oral histories preserved by Miwok descendants, and the sheer physical evidence of the rock together tell a consistent and well-supported story. This was food processing on a communal scale, likely accompanied by the social rhythms that come with any shared repetitive labor. Conversation, teaching, the passing of skill from elder to child across the same stone their grandparents had used. But the mortar holes are not the only markings at Chaw's, and it's here that the questions begin to complicate what otherwise seems like a settled picture. Scattered among the grinding holes are petroglyphs, carved and pecked designs whose purpose has never been definitively explained. Circles within circles, wavy meandering lines that seem to trace paths across the stone without any obvious destination. Animal tracks, rendered in careful detail, alongside shapes that resemble nothing recognizable at all. Abstract forms that some researchers have cautiously labeled geometric, for lack of a better word. Unlike the mortar holes, whose function is confirmed by direct useware and living cultural memory, the petroglyphs offer no such certainty. No account precisely explains what each symbol meant, or why this particular stone, already devoted to the practical work of grinding acorns, was also chosen as a canvas for imagery whose meaning was never written down for outsiders to inherit. Contemporary Miwok cultural interpretations hold that Chaw's has long been understood as a spiritually significant place, not merely a functional one, a site where the practical work of survival and the deeper dimensions of ceremony and belief were never fully separate. Under this framework, the petroglyphs may represent visual language tied to stories, teachings, or spiritual practices maintained within the community, knowledge that was never intended for universal translation, and was never lost so much as kept, deliberately, within Miwok tradition itself. This distinction matters. It reframes the mystery not as an absence of answer, but as a boundary, a difference between what outside researchers can document and what a living culture has chosen, or been forced by history, to keep close. Archaeologists studying the broader pattern of Sierra Nevada petroglyphs have proposed several possibilities beyond the purely ceremonial: territorial markers, records of significant events, or even a form of mnemonic device tied to oral storytelling traditions, where a carved symbol might serve to anchor a much longer spoken narrative in a listener's memory. None of these explanations are mutually exclusive, and none has been conclusively proven over the others. What remains consistent across all of them is the recognition that the carvings represent intention, deliberate marks made by people who chose this stone, already central to their daily survival, as worthy of additional meaning. Beyond the petroglyphs, the site holds one more curiosity that resists easy categorization: a scatter of small cupule-like depressions, shallower and more irregular than the deep, purposeful mortar holes, clustered in patterns that don't obviously align with any grinding function. Some researchers have wondered whether these smaller marks represent an older layer of activity at the site, potentially predating the more intensive acorn processing period by a significant span of time, evidence of an earlier, different relationship between the Sierra foothill peoples and this particular outcrop of stone. If true, it would mean Chawes was regarded as significant ground for far longer than even its impressive record of grinding holes suggests, a place returned to and reinterpreted by generation after generation across a span of time that reaches back further than current dating methods can confidently reach. It's worth pausing on how rare a site like this truly is. Few places on the continent offer such a direct physical record of sustained human return. The same stone, chosen again and again across centuries, worn down not by natural erosion but by the accumulated weight of ordinary, necessary human effort. And fewer still layer that record with imagery whose full meaning has been kept, whether by circumstance or by choice, outside the reach of outside interpretation. Chawes remains protected today, part of a California state park where Miwok descendants continue to hold ceremonies, and where the stone itself, worn smooth by 1,000 years of grinding, still bears the carved marks that no outside account has ever fully translated. What was carried in those spirals and winding lines, pecked patiently into rock already devoted to feeding a community. And how much of that meaning was always meant to travel only as far as the people who carved it intended it to go. From the granite foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the story returns east, back across the continent to the delta country of eastern Arkansas. Not far, in fact, from where this exploration began. Follow the St. Francis River south from the Missouri line, through flat, fertile farmland, until the land opens onto a low ridge overlooking the water. This is Parkin, a place that raises a very different kind of question than the one Chawes left behind. Not what a mark means, but why an entire town, thriving and full, would one day simply cease to be. The Parkin archaeological site preserves roughly 17 acres of a much larger Native American town, protected today within a state park along the St. Francis River in Cross County. At its height during the Mississippian period, Parkin was a substantial fortified settlement, a moated and palisaded town, its central platform mound rising prominently at the northern edge of the site, its houses arranged in dense, organized rows that speak to real civic planning. Archaeologists generally agree that Parkin was occupied from roughly AD 1350 to 1650, a span of 3 centuries during which the town grew, adapted, and by every material measure, flourished. There is even reason to believe Parkin may be more than an anonymous archaeological site. Many researchers consider it a strong candidate for Casqui, a town described in the chronicles of Hernando de Soto's expedition, which passed through this region in 1541. The Spanish accounts describe a fortified town along a river, ruled by a chief who welcomed de Soto's men with elaborate ceremony and whose people erected a large wooden cross atop their central mound at the Spaniards' request. An event that, if Parkin is indeed Casqui, would place a documented moment of first contact directly on the mound still standing at the park's edge today. Archaeological excavations have lent weight to this identification, uncovering artifacts and settlement patterns consistent with the De Soto Chronicle's description, though certainty, as with so much in this field, remains elusive. What isn't in question is that De Soto's expedition marked the beginning of the end for Parkin, though not in the way one might expect. There was no battle here, no siege, no evidence of the town's destruction by Spanish arms. Instead, something quieter and far more devastating followed in the expedition's wake. Disease. European pathogens, to which native populations across the Americas had no prior immunity, moved through Mississippian communities with catastrophic speed and mortality in the decades following first contact. This much is well documented, both at Parkin and across much of the greater Mississippian world, and it forms the backbone of the mainstream explanation for what happened next. By the time other European explorers returned to this region more than a century later, the large, complex, mound-building societies that De Soto's chronicles described in such vivid detail were largely gone, their populations decimated, their towns abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. But here is where Parkin's story resists a clean resolution. If epidemic disease explains the town's decline, it does not, by itself, fully explain the manner of its abandonment. Archaeological evidence at the site shows no signs of a slow, gradual depopulation, no clear sequence of shrinking occupation, no evidence that the town contracted in stages as its population dwindled. Instead, the record suggests something closer to a relatively swift cessation of activity, as though the town's final chapter played out over years, not generations. Households appear to have simply stopped. Everyday items, tools, pottery, objects of ordinary domestic use have been recovered in contexts suggesting they were left behind rather than carefully packed away, as one might expect from a planned, orderly relocation. Why would a town leave its belongings behind? One explanation holds that the speed and severity of epidemic mortality left too few survivors to maintain the settlement's complex civic and agricultural systems, forcing a hurried departure by whoever remained, unable to sustain the labor a town like Parkin required. Under this reading, what looks like sudden abandonment is simply the visible endpoint of an invisible biological catastrophe. The human tragedy of a functioning society losing so much of its population so quickly that continuity itself became impossible. Yet questions remain about where the survivors went, and how a settlement pattern that had defined this stretch of the St. Francis River for 3 centuries could dissolve so thoroughly that later expeditions found the region transformed. Some researchers have pointed to broader environmental pressures compounding the demographic collapse. Shifting river channels, changing agricultural conditions, or resource stress that made rebuilding at the same location untenable even for whatever population remained. Others have focused on the social disruption alone, arguing that Mississippian political and religious structures were so deeply embedded in continuous generational practice that even a partial loss of population and leadership could unravel a town's ability to function, regardless of how many people technically remained. Beyond the mainstream explanations, more speculative voices have occasionally asked whether Parkin's abandonment might reflect something beyond disease and disruption alone. Whether the arrival of De Soto's expedition and the strange new symbol raised atop the mound at Spanish request marked some deeper rupture in the town's relationship to its own sacred landscape, one that outside archaeology has no framework to measure. Mainstream researchers generally set such interpretations aside, noting that the documented effects of epidemic disease are more than sufficient to explain what happened here without requiring further explanation. Still, the fact that a wooden cross once stood atop this particular mound, at this particular moment of first contact, before the town's swift and largely unexplained end, is a detail the record preserves without ever fully accounting for. The mound at Parkin still rises above the St. Francis River today, quiet within its state park boundary. The moat that once encircled the town long since softened by time into a gentle depression in the earth. Whatever household plans were interrupted, whatever final decisions were made in Parkin's last months, remain unrecovered, scattered perhaps among the tools and pottery left behind by people who never returned to claim them. What was it in the end that made an entire town of that size, that permanence, disappear so quickly from the place it had called home for 300 years?